Que ya viene la revolución, para que se asustan será para mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando, ¡viva la revolución!
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
La bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito así, nada.
From Palestine to Bolivia, to Mexico, to Honduras, to all over Nuestra America, to all over the global South. Long live indigenous resistance. Down with white supremacy, down with settler colonialism. Fuck Zionism, fuck U.S. imperialism. and long live the Movimiento al Socialismo, long live the indigenous people's liberation struggles all over. Today, we're focusing on Bolivia. What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 99, Unmasking Imperialism, one episode away from episode 100. Bolivia resists fascism, exposing fascism in Bolivia from past to present. During today's episode, we're going to discuss ongoing far-right violence in Santa Cruz, Bolivia, and other parts of Bolivia as well. We're going to talk about racist evangelical paramilitary groups like the Unión Juvenil Cruceñista, if I'm pronouncing that right, that are murdering socialist activists and indigenous peoples across Bolivia. We're going to shed light on the political forces that supported the violent 2019 coup that ousted Evo Morales, one of my favorite leaders, and that continue to push for white separatism. We're also going to discuss the historical presence of fascists in Bolivia. Little known history that not a lot of people are aware of, but there were actually Nazis in Bolivia, of all places, that included German Nazi Klaus Barbie and military dictators like Hugo Banzer and García Meza, and Operation Condor that murdered and enslaved indigenous peoples. We're going to get into all of that. And joining me today are two amazing comrades who are doing tremendous work on the ground in Bolivia, who are joining us from Bolivia right now with that amazing green screen in the background. Joining me today are comrades Ollie Vargas and Camila Escalante of Kawsachun News. Ollie and Camila have been reporting extensively on Bolivia since the 2019 coup and the destabilization, and they founded Kawsachun in the midst of the coup year in 2020. Kawsachun News has also been one of the main English language outlets reporting on Nicaragua, an amazing country. Long live the Sandinista front of Nicaragua, from an anti-imperialist perspective, and the economic recovery in Venezuela. Viva Venezuela Bolivariana Socialista. Ollie is a host and reporter for Radio Kawsachun Coca, the official outlet of the 6 federations of the Trópico of Cochabamba. And Camila is editor of Kawsachun and Press TV's Latin America correspondent. Shout out to Press TV. Please support Kawsachun News. The link is in the description. Most importantly, please show them some love on Patreon. The link is in the description as well. These comrades are not getting paid by NGOs. They don't have wealthy liberal think tanks backing them. These are two Nuestroamericanos, two revolutionary Latinos who are in Bolivia covering this with their heart and soul, out of pure passion, out of wanting to do. They could be, comfortable like me out here in LA or in the UK, chilling, but they are in Bolivia on the front lines of the struggle. So please show them some love on Patreon, patreon.com/Kawsachun News. How's it going? Let's start off with you, Camila. How's it going, Camila?
Thank you for having us. We're doing it old school with iPhone earbuds because we didn't really get to set up otherwise. Maybe we'll unplug them in a second. But we're really impressed. Well, I am. I don't know if Ollie has followed you so much, but you're kind of old school with the anti-imperialist live streaming. And we're actually just starting to stream now. Actually, just when I went back to Brazil for the second round of the election was kind of the first time we started streaming. So we're talking in the last few weeks, we became kind of streamers. So we haven't done much in the way of promoting our YouTube. Obviously, people know us from other social media, but you've done quite a good job of doing these episodes really consistently. And some of our mutual friends have actually praised you for it. So it has me looking now at your YouTube to see what you're doing and what we need to be applying. But it's really good to see you. I saw you in Nicaragua last year, but it feels like even though it's been kind of a while that I always know, kind of what you're up to, always doing the same anti-imperialist coverage. And so it's really great to hear from you. And I'm glad you're putting a spotlight on Bolivia.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And it's cool. You guys are working with Boomer technology. I'll get you guys a flip phone to upgrade soon. I'm a boomer too. It's all good. But I appreciate we gotta support you guys because you guys are doing amazing work. And I'm glad to have you guys on. I really appreciate the work that you do, especially when the coup was taking place. I was following what you guys are doing after that. And also joining us as well, Ollie Vargas. Amazing articles, amazing videos. I've been following you as well, Ollie, for some time, and Camila as well. Ollie, I think you're from the UK. I think you're Bolivian as well, right, Ollie?
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Ramiro, for having us on. That's right. Well, my mother is from the UK. My father is from Bolivia, and yeah, I was working with Camila at the time of the coup in Ecuador, in Quito, and when the coup happened, I felt, we have to. I had to go back to my country to do what I could to help the people that were fighting. Help in the battle, multifaceted battle, communicational on the streets, to fight for the restoration of democracy. So yeah, here I am here in La Paz, Bolivia.
Yeah, and you know how it is, Ramiro. Like it's really, we felt like we couldn't do enough where we were in our last, workroom where, we were reporting before. I think Ollie did a couple of, like pieces for other outlets. We tried to do, raise awareness that was going on our own social media, but we knew at one point that we need to, have a little bit more of a more profound impact. And it feels really helpless. I mean, you know how it is being Honduran, same as it is for El Salvador. It's very frustrating knowing that there's not sufficient coverage in English for, our international comrades to know what's going on. So we took matters into our own hand, needless to say, and launched this new project because there just was no other space to really discuss what was going on at that time in this fourth revolutionary process here in Latin America. We've had plenty of good coverage and good sources for getting news from Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, and we just felt that that was missing for Bolivia.
Most definitely. And I'm glad that it's you guys doing it, because one of my biggest gripes with a lot of the Latin American journalism, it's either Latin Americans aspiring to be Western, unbiased reporters and following a bourgeois standard of journalism, or it's white liberals who go to Latin America, have no idea about the political context. They want to be, quote, impartial observers. But I appreciate that you guys are putting just out like pure objective information, but at the same time, it's proletarian journalism. It's from the perspective of working class people that you never hear from, because when the coup was taking place in Bolivia, I remember all you were hearing from were these criollos and from people in Santa Cruz and these very wealthy Miami type people who were just like, Evo Morales is a dictator and he's horrible and this and that. And so I'm really glad you guys were able to launch this. I remember in 2019 when the coup was happening, that day I stayed up the whole night just watching the news. And then the next day, I live in LA, in Los Angeles, and the next day we went to a protest in front of the Bolivian embassy in LA, and we almost even got into a little scuffle with some of the right wingers and shit. So it was crazy.
That day I cried. I cried tears, and everyone I know was crying the same. And I thought in that day that I wouldn't be able to go back to Bolivia for many years, that the dictatorship would make that impossible. But at the end of the day, we did go back, and we were able to join the struggle at a critical juncture, because we could see that this was an unstable regime. As soon as I got to Bolivia, I could see the power in every community, urban, rural, and we knew that if we can contribute in part to communicate to the outside world what was really going on, because most people around the world have never even heard of Bolivia. I remember when I was a kid and my family first, I grew up in Bolivia till I was 5 years old, and when I first moved to the UK, people didn't even know, had never even heard that word in their lives. Do you know what I mean? And before this coup, I think a lot of people, wasn't paying attention to what was going on and to the history of it and what the enormous achievements of Evo Morales. And I think this was an opportunity to show both the achievements of Evo Morales during the process of change and the abuses that are going on in Bolivia after the coup, the US-backed coup that we all know about.
Yeah, most definitely. No, I definitely know what you mean. And for me, I've always had, my heart has always been with Bolivia, because for many years, you know, Honduras is one of the poorest. I think it's right now is the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. For many years, Bolivia and Honduras competed for position of one of the most oppressed financially because of imperialism, impoverished countries in the Western Hemisphere. So we're talking about the poorest of the poor, the marginalized of the marginalized. Like you're not only are you one of the poorest countries, but you're indigenous. You're part of a nationally oppressed struggle. So it's important to support it, you know. And so I've always, when Evo Morales, like actually Evo Morales for me was like one of the people who really inspired me, because even within the Latin American left, like there has always been kind of a fetishization of more wider Latin American leaders. So to see like a Black or indigenous Latin American socialist come out, like Evo and other people from MAS, like for me, I was like, damn, like that's so powerful, you know, because you never see that.
Remember, you're right in that Bolivia was, before Evo Morales, was the poorest country in Latin America. Well, Bolivia and Haiti were, you know, battle that was for the two poorest countries. But the whole point of this process of change that began in 2006 with Evo Morales was what, you know, we weren't born to be poor. We weren't born to be victims. And from there, Bolivia went from being the poorest country in Latin America to having the fastest growing economy. And that was part of the story that I wanted to communicate to the outside world, is that, in fact, the outside world has a lot to learn from Bolivia about how Bolivia, you know, when my family left Bolivia in 2000, 67% of the population lived below the poverty line, what the UN defined as below the poverty line. And during Evo Morales' government, that was halved, and that's millions of people lifted out of poverty, and it became the fastest growing economy. And the economic model that was built is something that can, you know, teach other countries around the world. And so Bolivia went from being a victim into actually a role model, and that's part of why we set up this whole outlet, and that's part of, you know, I would say the most important message I want to communicate.
Yeah, most definitely. No, for 100% agree. I just quickly want to read an article. Again, check out kawsachunnews.com. Go show them some love on Patreon as well. This is an article that came out November 23rd, my birthday. Bolivia far-right protesters attack ambulances and health workers. Far-right opposition groups in the city of Santa Cruz, Bolivia, are violating international law by attacking health workers and hindering the passage of ambulances. The city's police have registered more than 20 cases of physical attacks against health workers and ambulances, many of them resulting in patients being unable to reach a medical center. Protesters say they want the national census to be brought forward 6 months, and their preferred tactic is to block roads and demand payment from anyone who wants to pass through. We've seen this before in Venezuela and in Nicaragua as well. Those who fail to comply are assaulted by young men armed with sticks and baseball bats. The Secretary of Health Workers Union at the San Juan de Dios Hospital, Ulises Guzman, said, quote, "I don't know what they're waiting for, maybe for someone from our sector to die so that they just give us guarantees." International human rights law establishes that medical personnel have the right to be protected under the same conditions as the wounded and sick, even in some situations of armed conflict. So I just want to quickly play a clip, and then I want to ask Camila about what are some of the human rights violations that are going on right now that we're not hearing about anywhere in mainstream media. So I'm just going to play this. This is from Kawsachun on Twitter. Also follow him on Twitter. Great videos on the ground. I'm going to play this, and then we'll keep talking about it.
Podemos observar el incendio ya que se ha propagado por toda una tienda de seguridad, donde también podía haber algún puesto de venta. También están lanzándoles las sillas, las mesas que hay al interior de esta federación, la cual se está quemando por completo. La gran cantidad de personas aún se encuentra fuera de la Federación Sindical de Trabajadores Campesinos. y la policía ya se ha retirado del lugar después de varias horas de conflicto, de enfrentamientos, donde se hizo el uso de gases lacrimógenos para poder dispersar a los grupos que estaban alrededor, la cual no se ha podido. La policía ha sido rebasada en este caso y se ha tenido que retirar de esta zona, de la zona de la avenida Irala, donde se encuentra la Federación Sindical de Trabajadores Campesinos, que aglutina varios sectores sociales.
So crazy stuff. Camila, tell us a little bit, like, what was going on there? What's going on now? What's going on with some of the attacks, and who is it coming from? Who are doing these violent attacks?
Well, as you can see, I'm on the computer now because literally this story is developing right now. After 36 days of this lockout, the president of the Pro Santa Cruz Civic Committee has essentially called it off. And what we can see as a pause, it's not any sort of victory necessarily for the government of the popular sectors per se, because unfortunately, we do believe that this is a time at which these far-right sectors and these parastate groups will be strengthening, and that they'll come back and make another attempt. And as Ollie will tell you, this is, of course, a lockout and violence that is largely limited to the city of Santa Cruz and is not generalized throughout the country, not even is it throughout the entire department of Santa Cruz. But it does have an impact. It's had a very large economic impact on the country as a whole, because Santa Cruz is an economic driver and very important and key to the overall economy, but it has harmed, the lives of many people, and there have been several deaths. And one of the things that I'm reading about right now is the denouncements by the national health authorities, as well as some of the local hospitals there, that have said that actually at least 5 kidney patients died during this period of 36 days because they were prevented from arriving at hospitals because of the roadblocks that are largely held by these gangs of people who huff paint, what we would call the Bolivian guarimbas. And so, these are some of the victims that are not even really being counted in the overall death toll, because we know that there were a number of other deaths of people who were killed by outright violence by these gangs. And the main group that we're talking about is, of course, the Cruceñista Youth Union. And people became familiarized with this group that supports Luis Fernando Camacho, who is the leader, he was the leader of the Santa Cruz Civic Committee and a very important key figure who led the coup in 2019. And because he wasn't jailed and he lives in impunity, never to face justice, despite outright confessing to his very direct involvement in the coup, his dad actually paid the military, the police commander, during the coup. He has not faced justice, and unfortunately, he was able to run in the elections just a few months after democracy was returned to Bolivia, and he won the state of Santa Cruz, where he is a popular figure, and now he's governor. So we have the Cruceñista Youth Union, which is strengthening and uses all sorts of conventional weapons, such as guns, also homemade weapons. And then we have other criminal elements, just gangs, street people. And so what we saw from the beginning of this was, first of all, a lot of people absolutely denounced, they opposed this lockout. They didn't want to see the paralyzation of the economy in Santa Cruz or in Bolivia in general, especially for such an unpopular attempt and issue, which was the census, which is, very much just used as a pretext, but not a real issue that the majority of Bolivians were really rallying about. So people didn't want to see everything shut down. And so what happened was these gangs were going around forcing businesses to close. You have drunks and drug addicts closing down streets and basically imposing tolls on people who wanted to go to work. And they were engaging in conflicts. We saw violent confrontations around Santa Cruz because, of course, a lot of the working class sectors wanted to carry on their work as normal. Bolivia is a country, if you remember how things are in Ecuador and Quito, where even on holidays or Sundays, you know, the markets, people want to open, they want to be able to sell and make ends meet because they make their daily bread every day by, you know, selling, by, you know, giving people rides on their moto taxi, opening their kiosk and things like that. And so, you know, these people defended their right to, you know, sell their meat or their jugo de naranja or whatever it is. And so these confrontations ensued overnight, in the early morning when they opened the markets, particularly, of course, in those working class neighborhoods where people depend on that sort of income. And you know, these people were the sectors that wanted to keep the economy open. You know, they stayed up all night, you know, 24 hours in vigilia, you know, on guard, on watch, making sure that nobody was vandalizing their stands. And they did, you know, suffer a lot of vandalism and ransacking, theft. And so this was just ongoing for weeks and weeks. And it's a very difficult situation. You have to think about the fact that a large number of the population in this city did support, you know, Luis Fernando Camacho, this right-wing pro-coup leader who's now the governor, and that they do control a number of gangs. They're receiving not only funding from, you know, these sectors of the oligarchy who continue to, you know, own businesses and land. Not only do they get that sort of direct income to fund this sort of violence, but they're also, you know, funded by, you know, just crime in general and narco crime as well. And so it was a very tricky situation in which a lot of people were calling on the state to intervene. And as we've seen, you know, in the case of Nicaragua and in other places, you know, people have had enough and they want the state to step in. But unfortunately, it wasn't enough to avoid, you know, the different acts of violence. And included in that violence, it has to be said over and over, as was the case in 2019, it is racist violence. It is white supremacist violence. It is anti-Indigenous specifically. And, you know, we saw, as of course everyone saw on our social media, the burning of a Campesino Union building, the burning of the departmental, the COD building. And, you know, this is very clearly aimed at the, you know, most vulnerable sectors of the country and Indigenous people in general. And I mean, if you look at the makeup of the Cruceñista Youth Union and the sort of, you know, literal Nazi salutes they use and this sort of thing, like it just becomes pretty obvious what it is. It's really undeniable. I think that was demonstrated in 2019. You know, and so it was, these sorts of things were highlighted in 2019 when the different international human rights organizations, which we don't think are, you know, the most you know, legitimate organizations all the time. We know that they are a tool of Washington to intervene in different countries. But in the case of Bolivia, during 2019 and 2020, when there were various human rights violations, including the massacres that took place in 2019, the victims of these crimes, who largely were Indigenous people, campesinos, in the case of the Sacaba massacre, they wanted these international human rights organizations to come here because we're talking about a coup dictatorship that was installed, and we didn't have the authorities or the political will to carry out investigations within the country. I mean, it was an all-out military coup here. And so they asked for the Inter-American Human Rights Commission to come here, which is an arm of the OAS, but acted quite independently to some extent from the OAS during that time, as well as Harvard human rights lawyers, as well as the UN system. And they conducted their own different, you know, investigations of what took place in cooperation with the victims and the victims' representatives and the human rights defenders here, the genuine human rights defenders here. And what they found was that these the crimes that were committed, apart from the massacres, of course, the crimes that were committed against the pollera women, the indigenous women, and against campesinos in these different standoffs and confrontations that were committed by these groups were committed by parastate groups. And they called for the dismantling of these groups. And unfortunately, in no real way have these groups been dismantled. Another one is the RJC, the Resistencia Juvenil Cochala, and these are still largely active groups. And this is why we're seeing this violence continue now, because they simply were not disbanded when they needed to have been. And these people largely live in impunity.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great breakdown. I really appreciate that. It's crazy to hear that. I mean, and I definitely agree with you. And it brings up a central question within the communist left, the debates over taking state power, and what do you do once you're a socialist movement and you have state power? Do you need to restructure? Do you need to clean house and put in people who are not going to betray you? And I think right now, as we speak, this is why I like the Mas Party and the movement towards socialism, because they're constantly experimenting and seeing what works best and what doesn't. And I'm sure there's many internal debates going on in Bolivia. But I wanted to ask Ollie, give us a sense of, a lot of people, like you said, Ollie, like don't even know, can't even point Bolivia on a map. Most people in the U.S., at least, because a lot of people in the U.S. are very politically ignorant, especially internationally. A lot of people aren't aware of the national dynamics and national differences. Can you give us a historical overview of Bolivia? Like, paint a picture for us as to like what the country's like, what are the demographics like, and how far back do these conflicts go? Because from what it seems to me, places like Santa Cruz for many years have been hotbeds of white supremacy and fascism because of the ethnic composition. Can you tell us a little bit about that, like the history of racial and class struggle in Bolivia?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's true. Most people in Europe or North America probably couldn't point out Bolivia on a map. But Bolivia is in the heart of South America, is right in the middle of South America. And is geographically is a very large country. Bolivia is land territory, is almost as big as continental Europe. However, our population is 11 million, which is very low. It's basically the size of London or size of Lima, and that's the entire population of Bolivia. But Bolivia is incredibly diverse, geographically and culturally. So Bolivia has the Andean region, which is where we are now in La Paz. It's where my family's from, further down in Potosí. The highlands, altitude of 3,600 meters to 4,000 meters above sea level, where there's only 60% of the oxygen that you would have in countries that are at sea level. It also has the Amazon. A large part of the Amazon rainforest is in Bolivia, in the northern parts. You've got the map there where it says Cobija, Trinidad. Those are all Amazon regions. So almost a third of the country is the Amazon rainforest. Then further down, where we can see on your map here, Santa Cruz, that is essentially the Amazon basin, is sort of lowlands, savannas, what we call in Spanish the llanos, the flatlands, savannas, sort of tropical type climates. And then in the south, where you can see the dot that says Tarija, that is a region known as the Chaco region, which is essentially a desert region, very similar to the geography of northern Argentina and Paraguay. Flatlands, dry desert, lots of oil there. And so in all of these different types of diverse geography, you get lots of different cultures as well. Bolivia has 36 indigenous nations recognized in the constitution introduced in 2009 by Evo Morales. 36 different indigenous nations within all of this different types of geography. And historically, during the period of the Spanish Empire, the economic center of Bolivia was here on the left. People might see where the dot that says Oruro, Potosi. Potosi was the center because there was the silver mines. That's where they mine silver. That the enormous wealth that there was in this Andean region. My own family's from the north of Potosi, where that dot that says Potosi, and the mining town of Uncilla. That silver, tin, and in the north of Bolivia, there's gold as well. That funded European imperialism for many years. The development of Europe over centuries laid the groundwork for the industrialization of Europe. That was the economic center of Bolivia. Up until, say, after independence, this region here, Santa Cruz, which we're talking about now, was very sparsely populated. Only mostly indigenous groups, including the Guarani, Ayorero, and other indigenous groups, very far apart from each other, very sparsely populated. It was mostly a savanna forest. In the 1970s, there's a coup led by Hugo Banzer, a US-funded agent who comes from this region and essentially used the wealth of Potosi to fund Santa Cruz. What happened before this? I'm going to go back a little bit. World War II happens in Europe, okay? We know I'm sure a lot of people know the history of some Nazi figures, Nazi generals going to places like Argentina, Brazil, Chile. Even today in Chile, there's an entire village, what's it called? Villa Dignidad. Pure Nazis, direct descendants of Nazi Germans. In Brazil as well, the south of Brazil, there's entire communities that speak German. In Bolivia, some Germans came. You mentioned Klaus Barbie, one of the top Nazi generals, came to Bolivia. Very few, though, Nazi Germans. Who came? Ustasa Croatians. Who's the Ustasa? Were the collaborators with the Nazis during World War II when Germany invaded Croatia. And the Ustasa were considered so brutal that even the Nazi Germans saw them as just too barbaric in terms of the racial violence they committed in Croatia, in Yugoslavia, what is today Croatia. Those huge number of these Ustasa Croatia groups in Yugoslavia, what is today Croatia, came to Bolivia. And they were offered lands by the governments in the 1950s and 60s, free land essentially in the region of Santa Cruz. A lot of it virgin land, some of it land where indigenous people lived, and they were cleared out, expelled from their own lands to make for these Ustasa Croatians to take land. Fast forward to 1960s, 70s. You have the coup by the person I mentioned, Hugo Banzer. From this region, he funds the development of Santa Cruz from a rural area into an urban city in order to benefit these Croatian Ustasa descendant families that have the land there in Santa Cruz. So Santa Cruz becomes the economic powerhouse, but their development was funded by the mines of the Andes, of the indigenous Quechua towns of North Potosi, where my own family comes from. So that's where the Santa Cruz becomes, an economic powerhouse within Bolivia. It was a deliberate policy. Santa Cruz city didn't exist before the 70s. It didn't exist. It was created in the 70s using the wealth of the mines of the Andes. So that's a bit of the history of how Santa Cruz came to be and why the context of the racial politics, because most of the largest landowners in the areas of Santa Cruz are the descendants of the Ustasa, Croatian, what was then Yugoslavia, now Croatia, and on the expulsion of the indigenous Amazonian lowland communities that lived and still live in those regions. So the whole city was built on the logic of genocide, of displacing indigenous peoples. And so now, today, that mentality lives on among those elites. They say, we are, in the Andes, the indios, they live in the cerros, they live in the mountains. We're more modern, we're whiter, we're more Europeanized, but that is where that European influence comes from.
Wow, such a great breakdown, Ali. I really appreciate that. Such an interesting history. It's really insane to hear about that, and also to hear about the mindset of fascism, and in particular eugenics. This idea that indigenous people are, quote, savages, that they aren't able to understand politics and economics, they can't run an economy. And we saw a lot of that. We heard a lot of that in 2019 from Janine
Ramir,
Agnes and others.
Can I add another aspect that's really perverse about this logic is the idea of us. So, as I told you the history of Santa Cruz about the Croatian influence, people coming from Europe after World War II, expelling indigenous communities, etc. They then create an idea. It's called the Nación Camba. Nación Camba, that's the people of Santa Cruz. There's the idea that is based off the European settlers that go to live there. Now, a lot of this conflict that we're seeing now is those people saying that we are the Nación Camba, we are the owners of, this is our land, and there are indigenous Andeans from La Paz or Potosí or Oruro who come to live here, and they are invaders. They're invaders in this land. When they themselves have... Do you know the name of the economy minister under Henry Náñez? Do you know what his name was? Branko Marinkovic. Branko Marinkovic. Does that sound to you like a Latin American name? Branko Marinkovic.
Hell no, definitely not.
Do you know the president of the Asamblea Departamental, which is like the state congress within Santa Cruz? Zvonko Ivanovic. Does that sound like a Latin American name to you?
Hell no.
Zvonko as a first name.
Hell no.
And they say that when Andean people, including, I've got one of my own cousins has gone to, now lives in Santa Cruz, that when an Andean indigenous person moves within their own country from, say, La Paz or Oruro, Potosí, to Santa Cruz, that they are invaders in Santa Cruz, and that they are guests in Santa Cruz within their own country. They are migrants, immigrants. You're an immigrant in your own country. That is the discourse from people who have names like Zvonko, Marinkovic. So this is the perversion of this kind of racial politics that exists.
Wow, it literally reminds you of Israel and Palestine. Like, you have these Zionists, these like pale, dying Zionists who are like, these are my lands, these are my territory, the Palestinian Arabs are invaders. And in many ways, it reminds me of Zionism and settler colonialism of the flavor of South Africa with apartheid. It's just insane to me. What I want to do, I want to play a clip. This is a clip that really stood out to me, that really boiled my blood in 2019 when I saw this. This is from the coup that took place when a mayor of Bolivia was attacked and she had a haircut. I'm sure you guys are familiar with this clip, but a lot of other people haven't seen it, unfortunately. I'm just going to play a little bit of it on Patricia Arce. And she was, attacked, and it just shows the brutal nature of a lot of the fascists. So I want to play this and ask Camila a little bit about the coup as well and the aftermath of that. Let me just find this clip real quick. Hold on one second. Yeah, here we go.
En este preciso momento está quemándose la alcaldía de Vinto.
¡Estás negando todo, mierda! ¡Te hemos visto, carajo! ¡Te has contratado tú! Ahí estaban los camiones y te niegas todo. Y a mis hermanos les dices maleantes. ¡Violadores, carajo! ¡Tú tienes la culpa de todo, mierda! ¡Es tu culpa, carajo! ¡No mientas y di la verdad, mierda! ¡No les has dado de comer! ¡Les has dado de dormir! ¡En el coliseo con colchones! ¡O no! ¡No te vas a negar, mierda! ¡Hemos sido!
Alcaldesa, ¿qué le han hecho? Me han cortado el cabello. Mi único error ha sido trabajar por mi pueblo. ¡Cállate, perra!
Crazy stuff. So just for context, for those of you who are listening, this was a woman who was a mayor, and she was attacked, dragged out of her office, covered in red paint. Her hair was cut, attacked, and just a victim of fascist violence. And in many ways, there's so many parallels to the sort of attacks that you would see as well in Venezuela during the coup attempts, in Nicaragua as well, when they would tie people up, handcuff them, attack them, brutalize them. In some cases, they would even burn them alive. And there's just this pattern of right-wing violence. And I want to hit on a point that shout out to Erica Keynes, who's in the chat. The rise of right-wing in Latin America and how they all seem to be in a network. That's exactly what I want to get at with this video, is like these tactics seem to be very similar to what the right-wing fascists did in Nicaragua in 2018, in Venezuela in 2017, in many countries across Latin America. There's this pattern of fascists using this sort of violence. And I know, Camila, you've traveled pretty extensively throughout the region. Can you tell us a little bit about how the fascists in Bolivia tie in with the international Latin American fascist network?
Like Venezuela and other places.
Oh, sorry. Remember, I went to go get water because we've had a long World Cup day here. So,
no worries. No, it's all good. No, it's all good. I want some of those coca leaves, by the way. They look pretty good. Now, I was telling everybody here that, like, I was showing the video of what happened to Patricia Arce, how they attacked her, how they cut her hair and threw paint on her. And I was saying how a lot of the fascists and the right wingers, they have the same intimidation tactics across the region. Like in Nicaragua, they were, killing Sandinistas, tying them down. They were spray painting their houses. In Venezuela, they were burning people alive and stuff like that. And there's this pattern of intimidation that they use. Can you talk a little bit about how the fascists in Bolivia, how they're connected regionally with other fascists in Brazil or in Venezuela and so on and so forth?
Absolutely. Well, like as an example, a very important example is that we saw in the, fascist violence, the terrorism that took place in Caracas in 2017, that they used the tactic of hanging that wire across the avenues so that motociclistas, the motorcyclists or the cyclists in general, because when there are those sorts of road blockades or so-called protests, it's very difficult to get around. You certainly can't drive a car through, so you have to go by motorcycle. And it targets those people, especially because they come from the working class sectors. In that case, in the case of the Guarimba violence in Venezuela, they were targeting suspected Chavistas, people merely on the suspicion of being Chavista. And I'm sure you've spoken about this numerous times on your streams. And the same thing happened here. Even if you're press, it's really important to say that that's why I'm not back there now. That's why I went for the beginning to report for the first week of this lockout, but I couldn't stay there because you really have to align yourself with one of the sides, and you basically have to be there under their guardianship because it's very dangerous to go around. It makes it very difficult to do any sort of independent work because you really have to, if you see that there's a certain group that's controlling the area that is, against the lockout, but they too have to be really tough and they have to be very suspicious and weary. of who's there. And if you look a little middle class, if you look like you might be from La Paz, or you might be some sort of spy or infiltrator, I mean, you essentially have to go introduce yourself to everyone. But that's because of the high levels of violence. So they were hanging this wire across the road. And of course, last week we posted that a baby of about 6 months had their neck cut because, not anything hopefully severe, but it's severe enough that it happened to a baby because the baby was riding, in her mother's arms on the back of a motorcycle trying to get to her. But someone actually died that way instantly. That person had 2 family members on the back of their motorcycle who were also injured. So the driver of the motorcycle died, and 2 more people were injured on the back, and another person at least was severely injured. Many others, in hospital. Some people, the way things are in Bolivia, and there's just this reluctance when it comes to getting medical attention because of the racist, deeply racist. You have a little cat friend there. Deeply racist Sandino. History. Hi, Sandino. Of how, the doctors and the medical, how the medical system works here in this country, that a lot of people don't necessarily report the things that have happened to them. But this is these are guarimba tactics that we're seeing here. And I think people have noticed that there's a little bit of a lack of sophistication in the way in which the opposition has operated here. It is clearly split. There are, there is infighting. This has been a very important aspect, and this is partially why we're not going to see so much success right away when they tried to do a repeat of, using the script that they used in 2019. It's, they're kind of making enemies among their own. This is clear in the fact that the president of the Pro Santa Cruz Civic Committee is having his house vandalized right now by the very people who supposedly supported him just weeks ago. They're calling him a traitor. They're calling him a masista. There's all sorts of, angry people right now over this decision to suspend the lockout. However, the risk and the danger right now comes in that, for the last couple of years, not just during the coup, but particularly since the return of democracy in Bolivia, these sectors of the far right have been building alliances with the international far right. They've gotten a lot of support and so-called solidarity from the Vox in Spain. They've received the loudest support from the right-wing Guaido allied sectors in Venezuela, especially on social media, that amplifies the message of the Bolivian far right far more than you would ever see it amplified even within Bolivia itself. Most of the support you see online for these, coup tactics and for, the different strategies of the right, the different campaigns they have, the media campaigns they have, the international campaigns they have, is all support from these, Lilian Tintori, Leopoldo Lopez, Julio Borges, and, these sorts of people everywhere. And like we saw last week, they had this entire, international far right conference, which was CPAC Mexico, where all these sorts of people were invited. Luis Fernando Camacho, the governor of Santa Cruz himself, was invited and confirmed at one point to speak at that CPAC. He didn't actually make it, but Eduardo Bolsonaro did, and many other far right actors did. And this is really dangerous. It's not something to downplay whatsoever, that although it seems like the Bolivian right might be, a little bit broken, fighting, making a fools of themselves, contradicting themselves in the media and whatnot, that they are looking for support from the exterior where they can't find it from within the country, and trying to build this whole campaign calling for freedom, libertad, human rights. They say that they don't have a voice in this country, and that they're being, their rights are being stifled, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the campaign that they're trying to copy and learn from, is that script that we saw applied multiple times since the revolution came to Venezuela, the same sort of script that we saw in Nicaragua, the same sort of script that they tried to impose and plan from the outside into and inject into Cuba, and these sorts of things. And so it is a risk in and of itself. And Ollie had something to add about the Vox.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something about Vox, Spain. A lot of people, I think, in North America don't really know who they are, because obviously they're not actually in power in Spain. Even in other European countries, you hear very little about it, but they have a huge role in the building the pro-coup forces throughout Latin America. So, who is Vox, first of all? Vox is the neo-Francoist fascist party in Spain. They're now the third largest party in the Spanish Congress. And they have a vision very specific based on Latin America. So their vision, they talk about Hispano-America. They don't believe in Latin America. They believe in Hispano-America. And they even say that we're willing to tolerate migrants from Latin America because they are part of us. They are our subjects. They are our subjects, so they're allowed to come in. And Muslims, they're a different culture, and they're not allowed to come in, which is ironic since Spain was once a Muslim country, by the way.
Exactly.
But they see Latin America as they believe in the reconstruction of the Spanish Empire. As outlandish that may seem, as mad as that may seem, that is what they believe. And although that's not something they're going to realize, but the work they do to realize that has real effects. So they work with Juan Guaido. They have meetings with Juan Guaido, open up channels for funding for the opposition in Venezuela. During the coup, after the coup in Bolivia, they were brought in as guests of the Bolivian government, and essentially they're the eurodiputados, the MEPs, members of the European Parliament, because they have them, Vox. They were brought in and said, look, European parliamentarians give their seal of approval for our current government and reject Evo Morales, etc., etc. Throughout the region, that's done. And there's been lots of, for example, in the case of Nicaragua, the European Parliament passes numerous motions all the time talking about we condemn the government of Nicaragua, we call for the release of this person, of that person. Look at who proposed that motion. It was the Vox MEPs. It wasn't the Social Democrats or liberals or conservatives. It was the Vox, these fascist MEPs. And then the rest of them vote for it because they put in pretty bland language, and we call for civil liberties in Nicaragua, etc. And they will vote for it. But the motion itself was proposed by Vox. So, and then once that motion is passed in the European Parliament, in the media in Latin America, they say the European Parliament condemns the government of Nicaragua. The European Parliament condemns this in whatever country, Venezuela or Bolivia, the European Parliament. But it was Vox, this neo-fascist party in Spain, that was the one that made the motion, that wrote the motion. And the motion wouldn't have even been proposed if it wasn't for them. So they play a huge role in politics in Latin America and in how Latin America is seen internationally. They're obviously not in government, but they're not a small party either. They're the third largest party in Spain.
Wow, that's great. It seems like Bolivia is in many ways being attacked from numerous sectors. Like you have on the one hand these Catholic fascists who, as a shout out to Saheli from Orinoco Tribune, Vox even talks about the Ibero sphere. You have like these fucking nut jobs. Like look at this guy in the back. He looks like a fucking crazy guy. You have these fascists who talk about bringing back the Spanish Empire. And then you also have like the evangelical Zionists, who I think are a very, very big threat. In particular, like here in LA, I live in Los Angeles, right? And here in LA, there's a big Salvadoran community. And there's a lot of Salvadorans who are evangelical and support Nayib Bukele, who's like the president. And they're everywhere, dude. Like they are very, very powerful. The evangelicals all over Latin America and the Caribbean are very powerful, tied to Israel, the Catholic fascists. But then you also have like these kind of liberal, postmodern hipster types who work for the State Department, Like I remember in 2019, there was like I don't remember her name, but she was like some like blue-haired feminist chick who was like, "Oh, I'm protesting against Evo in favor of like women's liberation and women's rights and all that." So they even try to copy the or indigenous, right? Like that was one of the things that was pissing me off too in the 2019 coup, and they're like, "We're indigenous people are rising up against the Evo Morales dictatorship." I'm like, dude, he's the first indigenous president, and he came like he has the backing of the indigenous peoples. They just hired like 2 or 3 guys who are pissed off with him and are saying like, "Oh, indigenous people are betraying Evo Morales and Maz." So it's just crazy. Like they're using all these different tactics. That's what's unfortunately very unique about Bolivia. Is like it seems like there's all these different factors going on. But just to kind of like wrap up our discussion here, I'll ask Camila first, and then I'll ask Ollie. Like, where do you see things happening now? Like, based on your conversations with people there in Bolivia, what are some of the contradictions within MAS or within the masses in general? Like, are there debates going on about what to do, and like, where do you see things going, Camila?
There are plenty of debates. I mean, there's a significant section of the MAS and its bases who have from the very beginning made those demands for themselves as victims of persecution, victims of arbitrary arrests, and other violence and other crimes of the coup dictatorship, that said that we need to implement justice right away and do a all-out crackdown, a sweep of these different actors of the coup. Obviously, we know that some of them were able to get away, and now they're trying to get 2 different people extradited from Brazil back to Bolivia to face justice. It's far too late. Others are in the United States. And some people are here, as we know, Luis Fernando Camacho and others who formed in some way or by extension part of the coup regime that didn't face justice. And so, there have been a lot of discussions, as I'm sure you've seen, about the way in which, part of the process of, a revolutionary process has to include the refoundation of the police and the military, as we've seen in other countries. Why hasn't this happened so far? And of course, the loudest voice, the most important voice in all of this is Evo Morales. And he's been very militant about, the need for change now that we've seen what can happen. Maybe it caught him off guard when it took place in 2019. And a lot of people who don't know what the fuck they're talking about in the exterior are very critical of him. They think he's soft. Yeah. But right now, he's the loudest and most important voice. And that's why we're going to continue to see the campaigns against Evo. Evo is the most targeted person right now in this country. And that's because he's very critical of the government that he's very close to, of course. He's the leader of the party, the leader of the MAS. He's critical in a very, friendly way. And he has people around him who also have said, let's take the examples that we've seen from Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua, all the best things that they have done, and apply them here. And because of that, he's come under a massive media attack. But, these sorts of discussions, we'll let Ollie continue, but they do certainly exist.
Yeah, wow. That's really interesting. Yeah, what do you think about that, Ollie?
Agree, Camila. While there has been a month of protests that has paralyzed one of the cities, it's important to recognize what has been going on. The violence is not a national issue. It is a regional issue in one city of the country. It's not. There was attempts by the opposition to do this in different cities. It didn't work. I remember in La Paz, there was an attempt to do a cabildo in La Paz. They wanted to do a rally of the style they do in Santa Cruz in La Paz. 6 p.m. San Francisco Church was the cathedral in the center. I went there 6 p.m. No one was there. There was a guy singing sort of karaoke reggaeton and people watching him. I thought that was the rally. So it didn't work.
Damn.
And that's the weakness of the Bolivian opposition, is it's regional. They can't have a national candidate because when, as I said before, these people in Santa Cruz, Croatians, the Marinkovic. By the way, I wanted to make a quick correction. The president of the Asamblea Departamental, the regional congress, is not Zvonko Ivanovic, it's Zvonko Petkovic. Zvonko Petkovic, that's his name. These people, do you think they can speak to even the middle classes in the Andes when they talk about, oh, the Andeans, la Indiada, there's sus cerros están viniendo acá? That insults even the middle class of the Andean regions, insults the right-wing parties in the Andean regions, is insulting their culture, is insulting where they're from. So you get a divide, cultural, regional. They can't unite because of their own racism. Their own racism stops them uniting. And if they could unite, maybe they could present a real challenge. Maybe they could win an election. But their own racism stops them from uniting. And that's been exacerbated now more than ever. Because if you're a right-wing politician, say in La Paz, in Potosí, in Oruro, in the Andean areas of Bolivia, you're a pro-coup, right-wing, fascist politician, but your own allies are talking about your people in a completely racist and discriminatory way, how are you supposed to react? You can't just jump on board with them, because then your own voters are going to say, hey, they're insulting us. They're insulting our city, our town, our region. So their own racism divides them and stops them from presenting a national challenge to the movement towards socialism. And in contrast, the movement towards socialism is the first time in Bolivia there's been a national movement. I told you at the beginning, Bolivia is an incredibly diverse country with lots of different cultures, 36 indigenous nations. The Amazon region, people in Andean areas of La Paz have more in common with Aymaras of Peru than they do with people who live in the Amazon of their own country. And Amazonian indigenous cultures are very, very different to Andean indigenous cultures, which are very, very different to the indigenous cultures of the south of the Chaco, like the Guaranis. Guaranis you have in Argentina, in Paraguay, and in Bolivia as well. They're Guaranis. They speak the same language in 3 different countries. They're very different culturally from Andean Quechuas or Aymaras. They're very different from Amazonian indigenous peoples. But what was the vision of the mass? It says unity and diversity, plurinationalism. Is that we're not going to force everyone into one idea of what it is to be Bolivian. We're going to create a plurinational country. And that's why in every region, in the Amazon, in the South, in the Andes, in the lowlands, the movement towards socialism exists in the different unions and social movements that exist, indigenous movements that exist there. And they look very different. They have different music. I've been to the congresses of these unions in all across the country. Very, very different, each one, different languages, but they're all part of the movement towards socialism. The movement towards socialism is the only thing that unites the whole of Bolivia. So that, in the face of regionalism, separatism, racism, will always win out. That's why I think this current period of violence in Santa Cruz was never going to overthrow the government, but they did want to destabilize it. They wanted to create a situation of chaos, and they did that. And now it's coming to an end. But the opposition, the fascists in Bolivia, are divided by their own racism.
I just wanted to add, because I do think that, I agree with all of what Ollie says, of course, and that is the case. But I think it's really important that while, we're very clear on the way in which, things are, that they are divided, that this is as far as they've been able to come right now, that they themselves are very clear about their timeline and the calendar. And though they know that, they feel emboldened because of their success in 2019 and being able to take power unconstitutionally for a year, that right now they're looking towards the next election cycle, and not because they plan on winning it democratically, but because they plan on applying some of the same strategies that they used in 2019 to try to use what has taken place so far, like you mentioned, they have used some of these indigenous communities and paid them to try to be their spokesperson and put them in front of the camera, in front of the medias, even though they represent almost nothing nationally. Nobody even knows, no one even knows who they are. No one in their own communities, exactly. And everybody knows that they're paid. I mean, it even came to light that, like, you know, once the money dried up, literally like 3 weeks later, they go back to their communities because they did like a walk. They came to Santa Cruz. They put tents in the middle of the plaza in Santa Cruz, and they did like a, you know, like a tent, like a camp. They were just like doing a little protest, and they, you know, use all these sorts of, tried to use, you know, indigenous symbolism of a very specific community and tried to tie that in with the pro Santa Cruz Civic Committee and the governor and their right-wing fascist struggle. So these are sorts of the things that they've been trying to throw, you know, trying to see if anything bites, if they can get anything off the ground. Not much has happened from any of that. The most they've ever gotten so far in this period has been this census, but they're going to continue to do this. You know, in the next couple of years, they're going to allow, you know, the holidays to happen and a couple of other, you know, carnival, but they're going to come back after that and try once again. And because they know they can't take power democratically, so they're going to be employing all sorts of other tactics. So although we can continue to say that in October 2020, the Mas, of course, won in the first round outright, winning 55.1%. Of the vote, and took back power because of the struggle and the militant actions taken by the unions and the campesinos, indigenous peoples, and the communities who, you know, who shut down the country until they were able to hold those elections to end the coup. You know, they beat all the other opposition parties, even made Janine Áñez have to step down. They know that this would be the repeat situation in the coming elections. So they're going to try other ways to topple this government, to, you know, subvert democracy in this country. So it's something to be extremely weary of, extremely vigilant of.
As well as that, one more thing. Camila alluded to it. There was an attempt by these right-wing groups in Santa Cruz, these Croatians, to co-opt some indigenous organizations within Santa Cruz and say, oh, for example, Evo Morales, he's from the Andean regions. Oh, this government, they only care about the Andean regions, not about the Amazon or Eastern regions. And you had the guy I told you about, Zvonko Petkovic. Zvonko Petkovic, our indigenous peoples, they belong to us, as if it has anything in common. Zvonko Petkovic with the Guarani, Ayorero peoples in the lowlands of Santa Cruz. There was an attempt, and they begun to do it, but when it became clear that the actual people, the actual indigenous communities of these areas did not support them, then the old racism came out. And you had incidents during this past month of violence against these communities because the communities, you know, didn't agree with the mobilizations, and these communities were targeted with violence by these groups who a few weeks before were talking about our indigenous peoples, you know, the Marinkovic, Petkovic people saying our indigenous peoples. So, as I said before, their own racism divides them, and yeah, that's I hope, you know, I hope the viewers have enjoyed a bit. Talked a lot about the history, I think.
No, most definitely. It's really great to hear from you guys. And two things I just want to point out before we head out. One of them is the importance of mentally decolonizing yourself from imperialism and colonialism and fascism when it comes to building socialism. And I think that's one of the beautiful aspects of Mas, is that it's also about dignity. It's also about sovereignty for indigenous peoples, because we know too well in Latin America, I think people in the US, you know, I'm talking to you guys from the US, in the US, a lot of white liberals kind of fetishize indigenous people and indigenous struggles. But in Latin America, there's so much racism against indigenous people. They are treated like second-class, third-class citizens, especially indigenous people who maintain their traditions and their garb and their language. It's insane, like just how much racism there is against indigenous people.
Is the whole point of the movement towards socialism and plurinationalism was not, because there's a temptation, I think, especially when there is discrimination against indigenous groups, to have separatism. To be like, this is not our country. Well, I mean, but every country of Latin America is a creation itself of colonialism, obviously. You know, these words didn't even exist in the pre-colonial era. But it would be tempting to say, for one group, say, Aymaras in Bolivia, to say we're going to create our own country. We're a nation, create our own country. Quechua, we are a nation, create our own country. The whole point of the mass was why don't we unite? Why don't we unite? We're different, yes, and we celebrate that, but why don't we unite? The Andean, Amazonian, Chaco desert, so different, so different, but what's the point of weakening our country even further? Why can't we bring together that all the strengths of that to take ownership of the country? And that's very different from a lot of visions that you get in certain liberal anti-racism projects.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ali. I'm glad you mentioned that. I think the plurinational model is very beautiful, and I think it's one that many other countries in Latin America and the Caribbean can learn from as well, and that I hope can be implemented, because it's the same way in other countries. Like in Honduras, you have the Garifuna, you have the Lenca, you have black, white, and you have everything. So there's so much that we can learn from Bolivia, and I think in many ways we can study that model and apply it in a way that makes sense for our particular countries. It's been really amazing talking to you guys. I do want to ask people watching and listening. Thanks again for everybody watching, listening. Shout out to David. Shout out to Where Pilgrim, to Saheli, to Itzel, to Erica, to everybody who's on there. Please support Kawsachun News. Please visit their website, kawsachunnews.com, and support them on Patreon, patreon.com/Kawsachun News. Doing amazing on the ground work. No NGOs, no like liberal institutions backing them, like completely independent, completely on the ground, and from people who look like us and who are of us. You know, they're not like these random Croatian dudes in the jungle, upholding these random people. So
Marinkovic.
Yeah, but it's no random like Marinkovic dudes, making a hustle, because that's a big problem in Latin America too. It's like you have these, I call them poverty pimps. Like they go into our countries and they make a living covering our people dying and all that. Shout out to Amanda as well. It's a dope episode. Please show some love to Camila and to Ollie. Kawsachun News, patreon.com/Kawsachun. It's been really great having you guys on. Also, everybody, please subscribe to their channel. They have a YouTube channel. I'll try to add that link later on. Please check them out. Not just amazing work on Bolivia, but also they did some work in Brazil as well, and Nicaragua and Venezuela. So please check them out. Thank you guys so much. I'd love to do this again soon. I hope you guys have a great week, and be safe out there. Shit's getting real. So, just be safe. And my best wishes to both of you guys. Thank you so much.
No, thank you, Ramiro, and thank you to everyone who's watched and participated. And we hope to continue raising awareness, not just about Bolivia, but all across our region.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ramiro. It's so good to hear from you, and thank you for having us on. And we really appreciate all of your work around Nicaragua. It's extremely important, and you form part of a relatively small group of people in the U.S., especially young people, who can get information to combat the media war, the media terrorism that targets Nicaragua as, its principal target right now. So it's been really great. And I'm really glad you've been able to put your videos and stuff together on that.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate that. Shout out to everybody watching, listening. Love you guys. Have a great weekend. Enjoy the rest of your Thanksgiving weekend. Peace out, everybody. Have a great day.